Night fell hard over the North Atlantic. The convoy crept through freezing waves, blacked-out freighters, a few tiny escort ships, every man listening for the sound that meant death. Somewhere out there, a U-boat was waiting. At 0117, a faint metallic ping cut through the static. The escort's sonar operator stiffened. Bearing 192, torpedo in the water. Engines roared, depth charges primed. Then something impossible happened. A flash under the surface, a shockwave through the hull, and moments later, an eruption of white fire on the horizon. The hunter had just been hunted. The ship's captain stared into the dark, whispering, "What in God's name was that?" It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was the first weapon that could listen. An airdropped torpedo that didn't chase coordinates or echoes. It followed the sound of a submarine's propellers, turning every noise the enemy made into its own destruction. Within months, the nightmare of the Atlantic, Germany's night-stalking U-boats, would start to vanish. Not because the Allies found them, but because the ocean itself had learned to hunt. Before there was a weapon that listened, there was an ocean that screamed. In 1942, the North Atlantic was a graveyard. Convoys moved like shadows, columns of blacked-out ships crawling through storms, while beneath them, packs of German U-boats waited. They called it the happy time. For the U-boat crews, it was hunting season. For Allied sailors, it was slow drowning. Every night the same pattern: a flare, a white wake, an eruption that swallowed a freighter whole. Then silence, except for the hiss of burning oil. Each month, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo sank. Food, fuel, soldiers, everything keeping Britain alive. Merchantmen steamed without lights, escorts fired depth charges at ghosts, and the radio stayed dead because one careless signal could give away a position. Captains' logbooks filled with despairing lines. Lost contact with convoy. Heard explosions astern. Rescue impossible. Too many submarines. The men called the ocean the Black Pit, a stretch between Newfoundland and Ireland where no air patrol could reach them. Once inside it, they were alone. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz listened to glowing reports. Tonnage destroyed, convoys scattered, Allied morale crumbling. His wolfpacks, 10, sometimes 20 submarines striking together, were starving Britain into submission. For the first time since 1918, Germany believed it could win a war by silence. The Allies tried everything: more escorts, longer convoys, primitive sonar. But the sea was vast and their technology death. By night, the hunter always heard first. Every ship's propeller sang its own death sentence through the water, and the submarines simply listened. It was a sound war, and the Allies were losing it. But in the laboratories of Britain and America, a few young engineers began to ask a forbidden question. If the enemy can hear us, why can't we make something that hears them? That question would birth the weapon the convoys had been praying for, the one that would turn the ocean from predator to executioner. In the depths of 1942, the Atlantic was bleeding. Every week, hundreds of merchant ships went down, each one taking its crew and cargo to the cold bottom. Britain was starving, America's lifeline was fraying, and the U-boats seemed unstoppable. The admirals wanted more escorts. The politicians wanted faster ships. But in hidden labs from Boston to Liverpool, a handful of scientists began to see the war differently. They weren't sailors or soldiers. They were mathematicians, physicists, and radio engineers. And they refused to accept that the sea was unbeatable. Their enemy wasn't the submarine. It was sound. They knew water carried sound better than air. A whisper could travel for miles under the surface. The Germans had used that fact from the start, listening to convoys through their hydrophones, firing torpedoes guided by hearing alone. The Allies had only crude sonar, deaf to anything that moved too quietly. So these engineers asked a question that sounded like madness. If a torpedo can see with a gyroscope, why can't it listen with ears? At first, the Navy laughed. Torpedoes were dumb. straight-line killers with no brains. Giving them the ability to listen felt like science fiction. But under the pressure of loss, the absurd became necessary. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, a secret division of the U.S. Navy worked alongside scientists from Harvard and Bell Labs. Across the ocean, British researchers at Fairleigh and Portsmouth experimented with underwater microphones, crude amplifiers, and wax-sealed vacuum tubes that could survive saltwater. They built prototypes that sputtered, spun, and sank. They failed dozens of times. But slowly, the impossible started to work. One night, in a quiet test tank outside Boston, an engineer dropped a model torpedo into the water. He started a small motor across the pool. The torpedo turned, curved, and locked on. It was listening. A weapon that could hear. They called it the Acoustic Torpedo Project, its secret codename, FIDO. It was small, silent, and unlike anything ever built. And when it entered the war, it wouldn't just kill submarines. It would end the fear of the night sea forever. By early 1943, the Allies were losing ships faster than they could be built. Every convoy crossing the Atlantic felt like a gamble. Thousands of men sailing into the dark with nothing but prayer and luck to keep them alive. Then, quietly, in a cluster of windowless workshops in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., that luck began to change. The weapon took shape under deep secrecy. Its real name was too sensitive to say aloud, so they gave it a harmless code. MK-24 Mine. It wasn't a mine at all. It was the first acoustic homing torpedo. They called it FIDO. It looked nothing like the sleek killers the Navy imagined. Barely 9 feet long, painted dull yellow, it seemed too small to matter. But inside, it held a revolution. Hydrophones that could detect a submarine's propeller noise, and guidance fins that could turn automatically toward the sound. The scientists behind it came from everywhere. Harvard physicists, Bell Labs acousticians, even a few Navy tinkerers who'd spent years experimenting with underwater microphones. Each man worked in isolation. None told the full purpose of the project. The challenge wasn't just engineering. It was silence. The torpedo had to hear a submarine in a world filled with chaos. Explosions, surf, propellers, depth charge echoes. Its ears had to be smart enough to ignore everything but the specific pulse of a U-boat's screws. It learned to listen like a predator. One winter morning, a group of engineers stood by a frozen lake in Maine for the first real test. A small motor churned underwater as the torpedo dropped into the ice-cold water. It sank, leveled, then began to move on its own, turning, homing, circling closer. When it struck the decoy and detonated, the ice cracked, the sound rolled across the forest, and the men just stared. No one cheered. They all knew what they'd seen. A weapon that made submarines mortal. By the time the U.S. Navy officially adopted FIDO in March 1943, only a handful of people on Earth understood what it could do. It would be dropped from planes, silently waiting, listening beneath the waves. The wolfpacks had no idea that their own noise, the steady rhythm of propellers that once meant life, was about to become the sound of death. March 1943. The Bay of Biscay, cold and endless. High above the Whitecaps, a B-24 Liberator from the U.S. Navy's Mad Cat squadron prowled alone. The radar had gone quiet an hour ago, but the men kept scanning. The German U-boats used this stretch like a highway. Then the co-pilot saw it, a thin, silver wake slicing across the surface. "Submarine! 2 o'clock!" The pilot banked hard. Below, a dark shape slid beneath the waves, too late for depth charges, too shallow for bombs. The crew had only one option, a new weapon they'd been ordered never to name. The bombardier armed it with shaking hands. Yellow casing, stubby fins, 4 feet of silence. The crew called it the dog that hunts by ear. "FIDO away!" The weapon dropped cleanly from the bay doors, hit the sea with a dull splash, and vanished. Inside the U-boat, hydrophones crackled. The soundman froze. A faint whirring rose from the depths, steady, patient, circling closer. The captain barked orders. Full speed, hard rudder, decoys out. But every change in pitch, every vibration from the propellers, became a beacon guiding death toward them. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then the sound officer whispered, "It's behind us." A white flash erupted through the hull. The ocean heaved, and the Atlantic swallowed another hunter. Above, the B-24 crew saw the blast bubble rise, then the oil slick spread like ink. No one cheered. They simply circled once, confirmed the kill, and turned for home. In their logbook, they wrote one line: Mk-24 mine, effective. The world's first listening torpedo had just drawn blood. Within weeks, FIDO would enter full service. It didn't chase coordinates, it hunted sound. And for the first time since the war began, the convoys finally had something the U-boats feared more than depth charges. The ocean itself had learned to hear. By the summer of 1943, the tide of the Atlantic was shifting. For the first time in years, Allied crews dared to breathe on night patrol. The wolfpacks that once haunted every horizon were now being hunted from above. The change didn't come from numbers or new ships. It came from a whisper beneath the waves, a weapon that didn't roar or flash, but listened. The Mk-24 FIDO spread quietly through the fleet. Each month, new air squadrons were trained in its use: Liberators, Catalinas, Sunderlands. Long-range patrol planes that could prowl the mid-Atlantic, the Black Pit itself. The men flying them called FIDO their insurance policy. When radar spotted a periscope or a faint wake, there was no chase, no panic. The pilot lined up the run, the bombardier flipped the cover off a small yellow lever, and the ocean itself did the rest. One drop, one splash, one silent kill. Within weeks, the numbers told the story. More U-boats lost in a single month than in any stretch of the war so far. Convoy commanders who once radioed for mercy now sent messages of disbelief. Enemies submerged and destroyed before first attack run complete. No counterfire, no survivors. The German Navy scrambled to understand. Reports poured into Dönitz's headquarters, boats lost without a trace, attacks from the sky leaving no warning. Some captains swore they heard mechanical whines before the end. Others said nothing at all. To the men underwater, it felt supernatural, the ocean itself turning on them. They began calling it the listening death. Every propeller spin, every vibration, every turn of a shaft, sound became betrayal. The very noise that once meant life now meant doom. For the convoys, it was deliverance. The men who'd spent years waiting for torpedo wakes behind them could finally sleep. The Atlantic, once ruled by fear, had started to fight back. By late 1943, the Atlantic had gone eerily quiet. Convoys that once braced for nightly attacks now crossed with hardly a contact. For Admiral Dönitz, the architect of Germany's U-boat fleet, the silence was unbearable. Something was killing his submarines faster than he could build them, and no one knew how. U-boat captains whispered about the ghost torpedo. Some swore they heard it in their final minutes, a faint whine, a hunter's hum, just before the sea lit up white. At first, Dönitz dismissed it as superstition, until the pattern became undeniable. Boats were dying within seconds of being spotted by aircraft. No time for depth charges, no time for escape. In desperation, German engineers began tearing through wrecks salvaged from shallow waters. Then they found it. Fragments of a strange yellow casing, and inside, a guidance system unlike anything they'd ever seen. It didn't steer by compass or timer. It listened. Panic rippled through the Kriegsmarine. The ocean itself was no longer safe. Orders went out across the fleet. Slow your screws, change your pitch, drop decoys. They built noisemakers, Pillenwerfer, chemical bubbles meant to mimic propeller sounds. But FIDO was too smart. It listened for the subtle, rhythmic heartbeat of real machinery and ignored the rest. In Berlin, desperate scientists tried to copy the design, but they were years too late. By the time they tested their own version, the Zonkönig acoustic torpedo, the U-boat arm was already bleeding out. Each night, more boats went silent. Crews stopped singing as they dove. Instead, they prayed. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become their graveyard. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had technological superiority underwater. Not with power, but with perception. A weapon that didn't see. A weapon that didn't think. Just one that listened. Perfectly. By early 1944, the North Atlantic was no longer ruled by fear. The hunter-killer groups now hunted with precision. Aircraft patrolled like sentinels, and every convoy carried the quiet confidence that if a torpedo came, the sea would answer back. The numbers told the truth no admiral could deny. U-boat sinkings climbed past 100 in a single spring. Crews that once terrorized merchantmen now barely survived a single patrol. Dönitz's own son went down in one of the new Type 9 boats, lost to a single hit from what survivors later called the Whispering Death. In the mess halls of Allied bases, a new kind of silence replaced the old one. No cheers, no boasting, just relief. Pilots who dropped FIDO didn't celebrate. They wrote in their logs, "Contact made, 1 detonation, sub presumed destroyed." Nothing more. They knew each sinking meant 40 or 50 men would never surface. Victory in the Atlantic was won not by rage, but by cold, mechanical inevitability. For the German sailors, the terror was unbearable. Some stopped using their hydrophones altogether, afraid of what they might hear. Others tried running engines at whisper speed, but FIDO's ears were patient. Once dropped, it could drift in silence for minutes, waiting for the faintest propeller beat, then turn and accelerate like a predator smelling blood. In 1 month alone, 43 U-boats vanished. Their coordinates logged, their positions never confirmed. No distress calls, just oil and debris. By mid-year, the Battle of the Atlantic, once Hitler's proudest campaign, was effectively over. Convoys moved freely. Allied ports began filling again with food, fuel, ammunition. Britain, once starving, was breathing. The war machine could now cross the ocean unbroken, feeding the invasion of Europe itself. The tide had turned not with a massive fleet, not with grand battles, but with a single, listening ear dropped into the sea. FIDO, the torpedo that ended the silence of fear. When the war finally ended, FIDO remained a secret known to only a handful of engineers, airmen, and intelligence officers. Official reports called it Mk-24 mine, a deliberate lie, a quiet disguise to keep its nature hidden. For years, the world never learned that the ocean itself had learned to listen. But its legacy never faded. In the decades that followed, navies around the world tried to match it, but the truth was simple. FIDO had been ahead of its time. It was not built by a giant defense company or a committee. It was crafted by a small circle of scientists, physicists, and sound engineers working in secrecy at Harvard and Bell Labs, men who tuned torpedoes the way musicians tune violins. Their principle was elegant. Not brute force, but intelligence. Don't outpower the enemy, outlisten him. That single philosophy would go on to shape sonar, submarine warfare, and even modern naval drones. Every modern anti-submarine weapon, from the Mk-46 torpedo to digital acoustic homing systems, can trace its lineage back to that small yellow mine that hunted by sound. But the moral weight of it remained. Pilots who dropped FIDO rarely spoke of their missions. Many confessed years later that watching a U-boat break apart underwater was like watching a slow death. There was no explosion of glory, just silence, bubbles, and oil spreading over the sea. One pilot said, "It was like listening to the ocean swallow a secret." For the men who had once feared the wolfpacks, FIDO was redemption. For the men who served beneath the waves, it was a ghost. And for history, It was the moment when technology became something more, when machines began to hear humanity's wars. In a conflict filled with thunder and fire, it was sound, quiet, patient, and deadly, that finally broke the silence of fear. The torpedo that listened had changed everything.